I've spoken before about what happened post-emancipation, right? When the plantations were desperate for labor, but of course they weren't intending to pay the free blacks anything. So they came up with the bright idea. Let's get some cheap labor from China. The Epson left Hong Kong in 1854 with 311 passengers. However, some of them died at sea, so only 268 made it to Jamaica. Of course, that number was still woefully inadequate, so the British went to Panama, where some Chinese were working on the railroad, and enticed 205 of them to sail to Jamaica. Perhaps harvesting cane was just not their thing, because shortly after arrival, a great many of them died. Cholera was said to be the culprit, and the ones that were still alive were suffering from ill treatment from the planters. A second ship, the SS Prince Alexander in 1884, brought more Chinese to the island. Chinese from the Hakka and Puntis ethnic groups were the main ones who made it to Jamaica. By the 1860s, the Chinese population in Jamaica had dwindled due to death and outmigration. Those who chose to remain formed themselves into a settlement on orders of the governor, and they started building post-indenture careers. One of the main ones was Robert Jackson Chin, who established a wholesale on Pecan Street in downtown Kingston. Now, Robert Jackson Chin's business success was very important to the success of the Chinese community at large, because he was able to offer credit to other Chinese when they had completed their indentureship. As retail expanded across the island in the early 1900s, most of the island's shops were operated by either black or white Jamaicans, but closely following them were the Chinese, which accounted for 13% of the nearly 5,000 shops on the island at that time. By this time, the local business community, many of them immigrants themselves, had begun to get nervous at the amount of Chinese not only coming and living on the island, but starting to establish shops to compete with them. So they lobbied the government to restrict immigration, and the government did do that by 1905, set up new laws that saw newly arrived Chinese having to pay a £30 deposit. They also had to pass a physical test and prove that they could speak and write 50 words in 3 languages before they could set foot on the island, which made it difficult but not impossible for them. Some of this ill will was also due to the fact that the Chinese immigrants, having been successful in their shopkeeping, had begun to branch into other areas of business, such as laundries, restaurants, and bakeries. They also famously ran illegal gambling dens, and the Japan lottery that is so widely known across Jamaica now is or has its origins with the Chinese immigrant community. By the 1930s, Jamaica's Chinese population was second only to Cuba, but the prolonged effects of the 1920s depression had started to affect that community. And as the economy in Jamaica grew worse and more Jamaicans, some of whom were working overseas, were being sent back home, then a little bit of anger started to turn towards the Chinese community. In a subsequent video, I'll talk about the Chinese riots of 1918, but the community has long faced criticism, not just of the way it does business, but that some of these business practices are exclusionary in a country where they claim to be part of the community and also depend on the community for their economic success. For example, in the 1940s, the community was criticized for having these communal banking systems wherein they banked with each other, and these kind of banking and credit excluded the larger community. There was also criticism that their gambling activities, the drop-on game and other gambling activities, were exploitative of the African Jamaican population, and they were not making any contributions in the form of taxes to the country's revenues. Now, with these shops, the Chinese seem to be well integrated into the local community, but then eventually racism comes in. See, a lot of these Chinese immigrants were male, and so they intermarried with Jamaican women of African descent. And then they started to raise questions in the community when they had children, because some members of the community thought that there is no way that these mixed children can qualify as Chinese. This disapproval of mixed marriages was not reserved for only Black Jamaicans. There was one report of an Albert Chang who, in 1946, died and left a will that disavowed the children of his white son-in-laws and saying that they were outside of the pure Chinese race. Their insistence on maintaining their Chineseness has at times created odds between the Chinese community and other ethnic groups on the island. Some of the criticism towards the Chinese community is really directed at confronting them with the question of whether they are Jamaican Chinese or Chinese Jamaicans. Through the establishment of the Chinese Benevolent Association and the Chinese Public School and even Chinese language newspapers, Jamaican Chinese were able to not only educate their children into their history and heritage, they were free to establish these social networks through which they were able to access credit from each other and set up their shops, in addition to providing funding and support to newly arrived from China. As an immigrant group, the Chinese Jamaicans are highly successful, and it's often said that if they can do it, why can't African Jamaicans, Black Jamaicans unite and do the same for our community? And there are two reasons for that. One, they're a smaller group. It is much easier for a group of 5,000, 10,000 people to organize and unite and make decisions to assist each other than it is for 1.5, 1.8 million people to unite, to organize and do the same thing. The larger the group, the harder it is to make such decisions. The second, and perhaps the most important thing, and sadly the one that people keep forgetting whenever they make these comparisons, is that every other ethnic group, with the exception of African Jamaicans, have been given the opportunity to establish themselves economically. The plan for us is, and always has been, that we were going to be the class of labor, that we were going to be the ones to work and provide the labor. Not bashing the Chinese at all, because this is such a great example of they were paid higher wages and they were able to save, and they were also able to have access to credit that was not available to the Black community. And that is why when other ethnic groups are able to access loans, we were not able to do so. When other groups were able to buy land or have access to land, we were denied that access. Everything that other groups have always, from the beginning, had access to grow and build wealth was something that historically has been denied from us as a group. And that is an integral part of the conversation that has to be had, that has to be acknowledged whenever we raise these points.